Reading in 2024 felt like you were picking up a book while the whole world was burning around you. Especially if you live in Nigeria, it was a very tense and demanding year. It was almost like you had to go against the grain. Like this year, I probably read the least that I've read in the last 5 years, and it was because there was just so much going on constantly. Like my attention span was short. I'm surprised that I can even make this list. That being said, these are my top 5 fiction books of 2024. At number 5, I have The Hike by Drew Magary. This was an interesting book, right? I felt like there were a lot of elements that came together. It was competently written. I don't know if I should give spoilers or not, but essentially it's about a man who gets lost in like this mystical world. Basically has to find a way to make it back home, and it incorporates so many elements of like folklore, or at least European folklore. It felt very light, and in 2024, I mean, you don't want anything particularly heavy. There were some nice little like life lessons in there as well. The fact that, you know, you're traveling through time and everything it is that you're doing is supposed to have meaning, right? And how like trauma, the journeys that we go on, we're all like sort of like going on kind of like the same journey, this life's journey, but you don't really talk about it, right? So at the end of the story, I'm not going to give you any spoilers, but at the end of the story, the man meets up with his wife and they discover that they have so much in common that they previously didn't know, right? And then they get like a deeper sense of each other, right? But then it's weird because even if our trauma, even if our journey through life are very similar to each other, it's difficult to talk about it. It's almost like there's an unspoken rule that you can't really talk about it. And so I like that nice little metaphor at the end of the day about how, you know, we have so much more in common than we think, even with people that we're very intimate with. It didn't wow me, it didn't blow me away, right? But the fact that I was able to finish, the fact that they had all these little cool elements was really nice. So it comes in at number 5. At number 4, I have The Guest by Emma Cline. To be very honest, I felt like the end of this book wasn't all that great. And it's an interesting thing. If you write, right, you discover that beginnings are easy, middles are easy, endings are like difficult as hell. Like, how do you end this thing? Even if you had it in mind that this was the message I was trying to pass across, right? You've basically spent the entire book passing across the entire message. So how do you then end it? Like, it's a very complex thing to do. Even Stephen King, one of his greatest critiques is the fact that he doesn't know how to end his stories. Like he has such a brilliant start, such brilliant rising conflict, but then resolution, the end, it leaves a lot to be desired. And I feel like this book was just like that, right? She's a very, very competent writer. She's MFA material, basically. I have a thing against books whereby I only care about one character, where there's only one character that I remember and I recall. And the only character I recall in this particular book is the femme fatale, the woman at the center of it all. She's this young, beautiful woman who feels as though the only value that she has in the world is her beauty, is her youth, is her body. And she literally feels like, quote unquote, the guest in life. She feels like she's a piece of furniture, and anywhere she goes and every relationship she has, she's just an accessory, right? She feels like she's not entirely real. And I thought that was a really cool concept. Especially as an introvert, I feel like you can really relate to that phenomenon whereby you're there, but you're not really here. But ultimately, I didn't feel like there was character growth. In fact, if anything, I felt like it was a tragedy. It seemed like she ended up in a worse off place than she started. So if you're telling that kind of story, then what's the point? So I get what your central thesis is, but then I don't quite get the point. So the only reason why this comes in at number 4 above The Hike is because you sort of like saw the flashes of brilliance. Like this is someone who, I mean, she has a couple of other books that I haven't read, and I started reading her off of a short story. So I know she's really good, and you could tell that she's really good. You could tell that she has real great mastery of the language. I wasn't entirely wowed. I wasn't blown away. At number 3, The Memory Police by Yoko Ogawa. This book is ironic for me because if I'm being very honest, it wasn't thoroughly entertaining. I didn't find it particularly enjoyable because you know how sometimes you're observing a piece of art and you can really relate to it on like on a technical level. You can appreciate the fact that this was very technically incredible, but it doesn't necessarily like entertain you, right? I feel like this book was like that. It gave you the same feeling that the characters were having in the book, which was that you were like in this dystopian universe where there were all these rules and there were all these consequences. It was just so dire and bleak. It was translated, obviously. It wasn't originally written in English, and it was nice to be exposed to like Asian culture. Typically, your neocolonialism is you're exposed to the British, you're exposed to the American, but then it was nice to really like get a sense of Asian culture. You get this sense that they're very respectable people, very kind of like Zen. I hope I'm not using that wrong. And this book, the dynamic between the characters, right, was it was all very I, I felt communist, right? I don't even know if I'm using that word correctly. It felt like them. It felt like the vibe that you get from them, right? Which is very, it's not like, it didn't feel like Japan with all its bright lights and its neon signs, right? It felt like, the Shaolin Temple with its austere architecture and literally felt like that. The reason why it's not higher up is just because it wasn't very pleasant, it wasn't very pleasurable, but it was stimulating where you could feel what it was that the author was trying to make you feel. And again, this was one book whereby it wasn't just the main character. I was invested in like a lot of side characters. It was dealing with a very interesting concept, and yet somehow, and this is a thing with me, right? I like books whereby the central concept is like, ooh, nice. Like it's very exotic and very exciting. And that's the reason why I read this book. If I had known that it was a bit more serious-minded, I probably wouldn't have finished it, right? But The Memory Police had strong themes. The central idea was that a group of people are living on this island and systematically they're forgetting things. And when they forget things, it becomes the law that no one is allowed to remember that thing. And in the process of forgetting, those things start to disappear. They literally cease to exist. There's some mythological narratives that gods only exist because people worship them, and that if people stopped worshiping gods, they would cease to exist. Well, this book proposes something similar. It's proposing that if everybody forgets that something is, that thing would cease to be. It's an incredibly cool concept. I almost wish that somebody else would pick it up and do something a bit more entertaining with it, right? But I think there's also something to be appreciated in the fact that that concept, while pretty cool, ultimately that's not what the book was about, in my opinion. I think ultimately what the book was about was like love and family and memory, yes, and the memories that we cherish, but it was about the human emotion, right? It wasn't about the concept. It was very real, very intertwined with the human experience. And I think that's in the hands of most writers, you'd probably want to go for entertainment value. I know I would, but the fact that you're able to peel that back and do something that's a bit more elemental, something that's a bit more human, that's worthy of appreciation. Number 2 is Going for a Beer by Robert Kuva. A little apology here. So obviously it's like, I'm Nigerian, I'm African. Why did I not read any African books this year? I tried. I read a lot of African fiction. I just did not finish. Just like I read a lot of other books, I just did not finish any of them, right? But that's on me, like high-key. I feel ashamed. It feels like I sold out, right? It feels like I sold out, not reading any books from my own culture, from my own continent. It does feel like a betrayal. I feel like I betrayed a me that is somewhere in me. I mean, it is what it is, right? You pick the art that you're exposed to, but you don't pick the art that stays with you. But 2025, I'm going to make it a conscious effort to read like African literature. I have to. I can't be the Drake of African literature, right? No offense to Drake. I love Drake is pretty cool, but yeah, I mean, I need to get myself steeped in the culture like K Dot. Yeah, anyway, so my number 2 is Robert Kuva. He's a legend, right? This guy is good, right? And I read his short story collection called Going for a Beer. And interestingly enough, the only reason why I had to seek him out and seek out this book was because of the titular story, which is Going for a Beer. Look, if you consume any media, right, you start to see patterns, whether you're into gaming, whether you're into music, whether you're into books, right? Like a lot of the stuff is the same, unfortunately, because there's nothing new under the sun. Now, Going for a Beer is one of those stories that reminds you that, look, there's all sorts of things that you can do with a story, right? There's all sorts of little tricks. It's not even a little trick. There's so much technical space to explore. The only reason why this isn't number one, to be honest, is due to my own failure to have like the mental capacity to fully comprehend and appreciate everything in this short story collection, right? There were stories on there that were like they were above my mental pay grade. Like they were incredible. You know how everybody's always saying, oh, learn the rules, break the rules. This dude breaks the rules. He breaks the rules and he finds a way to make it work. The supreme confidence to be able to like do stuff in such an unusual and unexpected way. It was a beauty to behold. Stories like Going for a Beer, the Goldilocks variations, The Babysitter. Some of it is pretty dark, some of it is pretty scary. His fiction is what they call postmodernist, right? So it challenges a lot of the established norms of the genre of literature. You will see a couple of things that you're familiar with, right? You will see Hansel and Gretel mixed in there. You would see The Princess and the Frog. You would see a lot of like traditional stories, but like he just completely dismantles them, breaks them down, and takes them to interesting new places. It's very absurdist, very metaphysical, very abstract. He engages the idea and the concept of storytelling itself. It's like Neo in the Matrix, right? It's almost like he sees the matrix of literature, and so he's able to bend it to his will, and like that is such a heightened state of writing, of being a fiction writer that one can only aspire to. And finally, number one, I think represents my complete and utter betrayal of my heritage, because it is the best American short stories. Now, before you judge me, there's nothing wrong with like exposing yourself to like other cultures or other systems, even at the detriment of your own, right? That's how the world became what it is today. But I cheated this year. So at some point during this year, I realized that, look, man, if you keep trying to like read at the level and at the frequency and at the length that you used to read in 2023, 2022, you're not going to finish anything. Like, do you know how many books I did not finish this year? Right. So I told myself, okay, where am I going to be able to find like the best of the best? Right. I could check out Granta, I could check out the New Yorker podcast, fiction podcast, right? But I also needed something that I could be certain that back to back to back, because the New Yorker, to be honest, sometimes they're here and then sometimes they're here, and I don't always understand why it is that they pick certain stories. Maybe they're just not for me. Same thing with Granta, right? So I just needed sort of like, okay, if someone sat down and he tried to pick out the best of the best, where would they be? And that is the best American short stories. So I read a couple of those, right? I read about 3 different years, but the particular year that I think really stood out for me was 2019 by Anthony Doerr. They say that Roxane Gay's year was pretty good. It was very diverse, which I agree with, which is cool. Diversity is cool. But I really liked Anthony's collection, right? All of the stories were superb. There were some really challenging stories that I'm not going to repeat here so that nobody cancels me or anything like that. There were stories like Jamal Brinkley's The Bubble, where you see like these 2 college kids, some guys, they go out to this party, they're trying to hook up with some girls, but then the girls bust them out of their mental bubble and they're exposed to like the deeper dynamics of life and existence. So many cool stories like that. There was Black Curfew, which introduced me to Karen Russell, who is another brilliant writer. The Era by Nana Kwame. Just a lot of like very superb stories. And I think there's The Wrong Object, but I don't know if that's the same year. Now, The Wrong Object is one story that when you're done reading it, you're going to have to go and take a shower. Things that people would just spit out or not want to think about, it goes there. And I think especially in this day and age, right? Okay, all these books didn't come out in 2024, right? But even any book that came out in the last 4, 5, 10 years has had the misfortune of existing in a very political climate whereby everything is seen through the lens of human rights, and there's now so many rules, there's so many school of thoughts. There's so many people that you have to try not to offend, right? So just the fact that that particular writer had the bravery to write Wrong Object, and the fact that Anthony Doerr was able to like put that in the Best Short Story collections is admirable, right? So that's my number one, because like back to back to back to back, if you're not like the type of reader who is comfortable reading all those Russian writers, right? If you're not the type of reader who thinks Wole Soyinka is light reading, you would be able to enjoy this, right? It was thoroughly entertaining, but it was still technically heightened so that, you know, it's calling you up, but then it's also looking you eye to eye in terms of messaging, in terms of language, in terms of the text and the narrative. And so yeah, those were my top 5 best books, fiction books that I read in 2024. And hopefully in 2025, there will be way more books of African and Nigerian origin.